when people make impact investments to make positive returns financially, but also to the environment and society. And these two things together is the essence of impact investing. How you get there is another story.
All right, welcome everyone to another series of Garten Infinity speaker series. Today I'm really delighted to have Eric Archambeau with us. He is a serial entrepreneur, previously a partner at Benchmark Capital before he went into more growth investing and has invested in companies like Spotify, for example. And then for the past 12 years, he's been what's known as an impact investor. And we'll definitely cover that as part of this series. He's recently started, 3 years ago or so, started Astanor Ventures, which is an impact investing fund that is also an investor into Garten. And we couldn't be happier to be partnering with Eric together. And more recently, though, he's also wrote a really important book, I think, for our times, which is called Costing the Earth. And the subtitle is How to Fix Finance to Save the Planet. So we'll definitely be covering some really important topics there. And I've actually read the book maybe a couple of times at this point because there's just so much great data in there and great action steps as well. So welcome, Eric. Would love to just maybe start with what is impact investing? Why is it important today?
Well, first, thank you very much, Michael, for the very nice introduction. The book was hard work. I guess if I'd known how much work it was, I wouldn't have started. But once you start, you need to finish this type of things. So, I wrote the book exactly for that. I wrote the book exactly for that, to try to explain why impact investing was important and why now. I think, when people make impact investments, they make an investment with a deliberate intent to make positive returns financially, but also to the environment and society. And these two things together, the idea that there's no tyranny of all, it's really the end that you'll be able to achieve, is the essence of impact investing. How you get there is another story.
It seems that all investing should really be impact investing, because it seems to me that that's the only way for our planet to recover, our society to recover. Do you think that should be the direction of all of finance?
Yes. Being a venture capitalist and staying a venture capitalist through a number of ups and downs in the past 20 years shows that I am desperately optimistic. And so I'd like to think that eventually finance is going to impact investing. And the only way to make that happen, which is happening, is to put the accounting system, to change the accounting system so every manager in the world will see the external costs that are not being taken into account today in the day-to-day managerial decision be part of that. So that if you change the accounting, eventually, and you take into account those external costs, their social, environmental costs, eventually every single investment will be based on profit adjusted by the environmental social cost, and therefore every single investment will be made on an impact basis.
No, that's very well said. And just on your comment earlier about how much work the book took, similarly for me as an entrepreneur, if I knew how much effort and work it took, and then going through COVID, maybe I wouldn't have started Garten either. But I'm super dedicated to the mission. And for me, what was the biggest joy is to actually be partnering with an investor such as yourself that really deeply believes in the mission and then also believes in the greater good, because the type of interactions that we have are about the greater good. And so I found myself having Astanor actually push Garten on ESG type of goals and on ESG type of measurements. And when we first talked about it, I was just really positively surprised and feeling very happy. It's like, oh wow, here's a case of an investor deeply caring about us, deeply caring about the environment, and actually pushing us to be better for ourselves and for the environment. And so from a personal company experience, I felt really grateful that you're actually here, that Astanor exists. And it got me through some really tough times with COVID as well, knowing that support is there. And it's not just a financially motivated support, it's a support motivated by what's best for everyone, the environment, society, and so on. And so just wanted to also express my gratitude there.
Returning the compliment, I would like to say that it's easier to work with a company like Garten, an entrepreneur like you, because there is an alignment of intentionality at the very beginning of the discussion with you. You started Garten clearly with a certain number of values, but even then, the service and the product that Garten intends to sell and to its customers is clearly about improving wellness. It's also about looking at the entire supply chain. Where does the food come from? Where does the beverages come from? How do you deliver your services? And you are looking at all the environmental footprint of that, as well as the well-being of the people who are part of the companies that you are serving. So this alignment in intentionality was the start of the discussion, the start of the journey of our investment. What we did was merely to help you develop the tools and processes to start measuring that and start maybe improving on some of what you are doing, but even more importantly, the ability for you as a company to pass that information, this crucial information, to your own customers, so that they would realize the importance and the impact that they were having on their own employees by using the Garten services.
That's very well said, and it's nice to not just be, again, motivated by just a financial outcome, because maybe the best financial outcome could have been, okay, let's just provide ultra processed foods because they have the highest margin, but let's actually look at the people cost and consistently enforce that from a board perspective and investment perspective. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. In your book, you also talk a little bit about how do we actually get to measuring all of this? And you mentioned life cycle analysis. How does that work? Is that practical for companies to do?
Well, there is at the very beginning, when you first start thinking this way, it kind of changes your frame of mind. So there is an effort to be made there. The good news is, just in the past 5 years, when we started, there were very few practitioners in the US or in Europe that would be capable of conducting these LCAs and conducting them at a cost that was not prohibitive. If you have a startup company, you cannot afford to spend a few millions on an LCA or LCAs. The good news is it has become much more developed as a practice. There are quite a few consulting companies, consultants doing that. There are more libraries also which are available. Maybe like today you have libraries for AI, deep learning, and so on that you can reuse. There are quite a few libraries of LCAs that are parameterizable, and so you can actually reuse them without having to bear a very high cost. So the way it works, an LCA is a life cycle analysis. So you'll be looking at the entire supply chain from where the products you are using are coming from, and you're going to be going through the very end to the source, so that you'll even be looking at the type of agriculture that people will be using to produce, say, some corn, and that corn will be processed by a company that will be processing it. So at the end, you may have some, I'm not going to say corn syrup, so I hope you're not going to be using corn syrup, but let's say corn flour, and this corn flour will have been produced by a miller that may use more or less sustainable practices and so on. So you're going to be looking at the entire supply chain, ascribing a cost, environmental cost, to each of the steps, and that will have been computed ahead of time, maybe in some libraries, and or will be computed by the consultant. So at the end, you have an integrated view of the environment, the various environmental costs that in terms of carbon, CH4 emissions in the atmosphere, it could be impact on water use, it could be biodiversity loss that such and such practices will have done, and so on. And so some companies have some fairly complex LCAs, which is your case because you have multiple stream of products and suppliers. And but at the end, once you have done that once, the incremental cost of adding a new supplier, of adding a new type of food, a new type of whatever service you are giving to your companies, your customers, is going to be relatively simple to add. So it's much better to start when you're a small company than try to do it when you're the size of Unilever or Nestle or GE or whatever, because then you'll have so many suppliers that's going to be much more difficult to do.
No, that's great to hear that it's available to startups. It's available more as tooling now, and that the whole industry is really developing, which is super helpful. And then it becomes really a key input because, for example, if the end product that you're developing is sourced from regenerative farms, then that positively then affects the life cycle analysis. It then positively affects the externalities that you're trying to capture as part of your accounting system. And so what does that new accounting system really look like? I think in your book, I saw essentially there's this concept of triple bottom line, which is not a one-dimensional accounting system, but really looks at multiple factors to capture all of this. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So this triple bottom line is the concept that has been driving the change in accounting system. At the end, accounting is about dollars or euros or yens. So it's really about bringing everything back to monetary units. Mm-hmm. But you need to start from, what type of additional costs you're going to be computing. And they are, so you have basically your financial costs that are just purely about what you are doing in your company in terms of hard processes, what you're doing. And then you have the little bit more softer ones that are outside of the company and that are linked to the way you are buying and distributing your products, mm-hmm. and where that comes from. And there are two large, so that's why people talk in general about triple bottom line, because you're adding one bottom line which has to do with environmental and one bottom line that has to do with social costs. So when you add those three lines, your hardcore financial based on your processes inside the company, plus the social, plus the environmental cost, you're going to get a higher level. Normally, you're going to get more cost than you would have. So your actual real profit, corrected from this additional cost that you were not accounting for before, is going to be lower. Or not, because you could imagine in the case, for example, of regenerative agriculture, that the more we use this practice in the fields, the more we recapture carbon in the soil. And it might be that actually you are improving the earth balance sheet. Because one of the biggest issues is, nature has not been complaining so far, although it's starting to complain, but nature has not been complaining so far when we have been borrowing from the balance sheet of nature and, getting something out of the soil, yeah. and basically, not replacing it. That's that. And if that's what you have been doing with your company, if you have a company that is very extractive, you have been borrowing from the natural balance sheet, and your profits are somewhat not necessarily artificial, but they are a liability that we are pushing down to the next generation. Yeah. And I think right now the new generation, the people who are in their teens and early 20s, are starting to complain about that. They say, well, you know what, guys, you are going to leave us a planet that is, has been depleted from its natural resources. Who is going to be paying for that? And we're not sure we want to pay for that as the new generation. you guys should do something about it before you leave this planet.
Yeah, I think it's just such a key concept, borrowing from nature's balance sheet, because that's often not captured. And I quite like the example that you had in your book about you might go into a supermarket and you buy a veggie burger and you actually think, okay, well, I'm doing something good for nature. But if you actually account for all of the pieces into that, it might actually not be the case, because you may actually have a better impact eating a grass-fed burger that's local versus, a veggie burger that's processed many times over in different countries. Do you mind just commenting on that a little bit too? Because that's kind of a difficult concept, I would say, for consumers to really grasp.
Right. But again, I don't want people to think that every single veggie burger is much worse than every single beef burger, because that's not the case. But yeah, you have corner cases where indeed a beef burger coming from a regenerative farm that has been raising this particular animal in a very caring way, which there are quite a few farmers doing that, has a much better footprint on the environment when you account not just for the emissions that different cows are doing, but also the positive biodiversity effect that small herds of ruminants have on the soil. It's something we have started to measure. It's something relatively new, but really the fact that a prairie lives in symbiosis with animals. We used to have bisons. We used to have buffaloes in the US and bisons and aurochs and other things in Europe. They have been mostly destroyed. It's not very compatible with 10 billion people on the planet to have a herd of a few million bisons roaming the prairie. So for a number of reasons, because we're very numerous on this planet, it's very difficult to bring back those wild animals. But we have the very tame descendants of them, which are the cows. And those cows play a role in biodiversity, in making sure that through their dungs, you have your insects that in turns feed birds and lots of other things like that. On the other hand, your veggie burger could be coming from a soy plantation. And if we were to actually account for that and look at the really negative environmental and social cost these burgers have on the planet versus the potentially positive impacts socially and environmentally that your local meat burger has on the planet, you would be surprised to find that the bad guy is the soy burger and the good guy is the beef burger. Very counterintuitive and maybe definitely not true for everything, but that's worth mentioning that without data, it's very easy to get confused on what is good, what is bad for the planet.
So as a consumer, I am not fully sure, how do I support what's best for the planet? How do I even know that something has a good LCA that's not borrowing from nature's balance sheet? What can I do as a consumer?
Right. That's an excellent question, Michael. And unfortunately, I don't have a simple, clear, immediate answer because we are really living through a transition right now where consumers are becoming aware of the lack of transparency in the supply chains. They are becoming aware that the USDA recommended daily numbers are not significant enough anymore. They represent something which is a theoretical value. It doesn't really correspond to the actual piece of meat or the actual fruit you have in front of you. It's an average, it's an ideal average, but it's not what you have in front of you. So the information should be about the actual piece of meat or the actual piece of vegetables or this prepared burger that I have in front of me. And that's still fairly inaccurate and incomplete. So it's a big opportunity. I see that as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for some companies to come up with a suite of software tools that will be capable of with some integrity. So you can think about blockchains, you can think about, or at least, simplified blockchains. There's no need to have such a cost for something ephemeral like an Apple. But, all this transparency in the supply chain that needs to be, it needs to be accurate and needs to be trustable, and needs to be simple enough for someone not to have to do a PhD in nutrition before they can say, yeah, I'm going to buy this product versus this product. So how do we get that? It probably needs also some form of personalization eventually, so that what is good for me may not be good for you. You may have some allergies. You may have maybe in a different state of, your own development, personal, everything. So all of that, I believe, is going to be solved in the near future. But today, unfortunately, still confusing for the consumer.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because it's really hard to tell what is good for the environment, what's good for myself. There's just a lot of confusing information out there too, because every company will claim that, oh, my products are the best. And so how do I truly verify that? From a garden perspective, how we're attempting to solve the problem, and we have to take baby steps because it's so complex. But one is putting together a group purchasing entity so that all of our local operators can directly purchase from local regenerative organic farms and then make meals out of them, for example. So that's, even without the measurement, that will have a positive impact. So that's a simple step that we can take. Two is then to expose the data that we do have. And we'll get into this topic in a second, is an ESG dashboard. So we can measure all the inputs that we can provide from the equipment that's on site, for example, the transportation that's provided, the social impacts of the types of products that we provide. If, for example, a specific snack is made by a women-owned or minority-owned owner, we want to certainly expose that. And so there's certain simple steps there. And then future forward, the vision is to really, as you said, make it personally applicable. How do we make well-being that's holistic for somebody? Because everything interacts. It's not just, here's a silver bullet, go exercise 3 times a week. Well, if you exercise 3 times a week and you eat ultra-processed foods, you're not going to be healthy. And so how do we make it holistic, yet personalized to your idea? And so there's still quite a bit of work to be done there, but, one step at a time.
Yes, and I think consumers are not... they're both, they want to believe, but they're not naive. And what is very important is the trust. I think, what made Whole Foods, for example, successful was that even when people were not sure about what they were buying, they knew they would trust Whole Foods to filter, at least until, certain acquisition. They would trust Whole Foods to be giving them good things, that as far as they knew, if they knew anything bad, they would not give that to them. I think the same with Garten. Garten has developed that brand that people can trust them, can trust Garten, that you're not going to give them bad things, even if you don't have all the information you have, and as much as you can get is going to be something you can trust. And that trust is the key for making up for the time being for some lack of transparency in the supply chain. So I think this is important. But you touched something super important, which is basically, and I call that in a bit cheekily in my book, you are what your food ate. Mm-hmm. So we definitely, we are thinking. We are thinking animals. We have this great gift that most probably no other animal on this planet has, of being able to think and reflect, and that gives us this power of the mind. But the mind without a body which is in great shape is going to be weakened, and vice versa. I think a very strong body without a mind is is not really not very strong at the end of the day. So this balance between the two is very important, but the food and is very important. Unfortunately, it's not just about what we eat, it's also about what our food itself got from the farmers and from the soil. And that is the key that we need to solve. It's not just about eating an apple, it's eating an apple that itself was nourished by a very healthy soil. And that's the thing that we need to go through.
Yeah, this reminds me of actually when I first came to the States when I was a teenager from Germany. I walked into your regular supermarket in California, and essentially I saw a number of apples, and they looked beautiful, amazing, all of them very nicely packed, really deep red and really shiny. And then I bought one and I bit into it, and I was like, this tastes like plastic. Like, what happened? And so, to your point, that apple was probably made with lots of pesticides. It was waxed. It may have even been colored on the way. I've heard about situations like that where it was actually not quite a ripe apple, but in order to appeal to consumer taste, let's actually just color it in. And so it's a really important point. What your food ate is exactly what you're then going to ingest. And it also reminds me, I had a conversation a while back at Stanford with Dr. Pamela Peake, and she was talking about epigenetics and what kicked off the epigenetics field. So she basically talked about a study where there was a yellow-furred, overweight mouse that had a genetic defect. And then what the researchers did, they basically said, okay, how do we methylate a specific gene so that the offspring actually doesn't have that genetic defect? And so they fed the mouse kale, and the offspring ended up being brown-furred and not overweight. And the offspring that didn't get the kale still had and that was on the previous diet, still had the same offspring that was produced. So it's just amazing how much of an impact the things that we ingest into our body, into our minds, really have on us. And it's not just on us, it's on our future generations. So if we're going to keep feeding our plants, our the animal proteins that we consume with ultra-processed ingredients and things that are not good for them, and feed them with antibiotics and lots of pesticides, fungicides, all of that, then what's going to happen to our offspring? And so it's such an important concept that you mentioned.
Yeah. Yes, I think you are lucky to live in a corner of the world, Bay Area in California, where you are first of all aware of many people are aware of the issues around nutrition and not just nutrition in terms of balance of carbohydrate and lipid and so on, but really the quality of the food, which is very important. Unfortunately, we have a system that has been developed in the past 70 years or so that has been about delivering the cheapest calorie possible, and was the goal in very large quantity, and that has been very successful at delivering that cheap calories in large quantities. But it's like game theory, if you have that, it's very difficult to get out of that unless you change the game, the rule of the game. And we need to move towards, delivering cheap nutrients. And that paradigm shift has not happened yet, or not in large quantity enough. So it's still mostly for, I would call that a form of elite. It's not just about money, obviously. It's about knowledge. Again, the inequality is not that much about, in terms of food at least, it's not that much about money. It's really about knowledge. And unfortunately, that gap has not been filled yet. And that's why I think this, software solution, mostly software solution, that needs to be put in place to help people, understand what they are buying, whether it's good for them personally, not good for the next guy, is the key in the future to make that happen.
It's such an important point, because the thing that we often struggle with when we get into a new office, and let's say we provide 100% good for you foods, let's say we have a tiering system. So it's tier 1 to tier 5 being the best. It's things like nuts, seeds, fruits, organic, biodynamic, local, and so on. And then tier 4 is, maybe some slight processing here or there, but still very good for you. Tier 4 and 5 help with preventing disease. But then tier 1 through 3 start increasing disease. So if you have lots of refined sugar, for example, in a tier 3 product, one of my favorite examples is there's a brand of juice that's an aloe vera juice, but then in a bottle about this size has about 30 grams of added sugar. And so when you're actually drinking it, then it's not any better than drinking a soda, for example. And so that whole educational piece is really important for us to get right with our customers. And we're still figuring out how to best do that, because we get into conversations like, oh, my top engineer really needs a soda and he's going to quit if he doesn't. And he's going to be super upset. So we need to provide it. Even though the soda may be a tier 1 product and super bad for everybody that's there, but that engineer maybe feels really happy when he drinks the soda and he wants that consistent effect. And same with other types of foods. And so the education piece is super important. And we actually think from our end, it needs to come from the top. It needs to be a culture of well-being that needs to be instituted so that the company itself that's implementing Garten can say, we are taking a stance and here's what that looks like. And if you provide sodas, maybe then you do it in a very limited fashion, and maybe you actually have people check out and say, okay, I need to pay for this, or not provide it at all. That would be the best solution.
Right. So there's one big impediment to just education, is that, and that's something I lived through when I was the chair of the Jamie Oliver Food Foundation, where we were developing programs to help families and especially kids to eat better. And how do you define better? And we especially looked at sugar because it has a big influence, not the only one, but it has a big influence on kids' unfortunate ability to develop diabetes type 2 even before they are 18, which should not happen, but it happens. And the problem that we have been bumping into, which is a fundamental problem, is that even more than smoking, when you tell people, look, what you are eating is bad for you, and people say, how bad is it? Well, you say, well, in 25 years, you're going to be dead. And people say, wow, that's scary, 25 years. Maybe I should do something about it in 24 years or 20 years, And so this is the problem about nutrition. It's a very slow moving poison in your, bad nutrition is a very slow moving process, or very slow moving poison in your body that takes a long time before it has a debilitating effect. Then it might be too late. But, this is human. Humans are really good at reacting to immediate danger. If I hear a fire alarm, I'm going to be reacting. I'm going to do something. Most people do. They actually are going to do something. They're going to get out of the building. They will pay attention. But if you have a obesity alarm that says, hey, in 25 years it's going to happen, they say, yeah, okay, can you please shut down the alarm? I understand, and I will do something later. And this later, once you cross a certain level, it becomes more and more difficult to do something about it. So, I don't have a very easy answer to that, except that, as you said, giving examples, nudging people into things, and showing them by examples that it's not just about the danger, it's also about the pleasure of being in great shape, of having the ability to think much clearer than if you are digesting like a big animal. You are digesting all day long about what you have been eating. So that is and going through ups and downs in terms of energy if you eat too much sugar. So all of that is part of education, but it's also part of leadership, as you said. I think the leadership in companies and or in the suppliers like Garten need to be able to show that, that type of leadership is not easy to bring, but we need that in today's world.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned that. It reminds me of a case study that we did, and this was an employee at one of the customers that we served, and he basically said, "Hey, for the past 3 months, I just ate garden foods and I lost 25 pounds." And I mean, that's such a great outcome for everyone. And basically said, "Oh, I started cutting out refined sugars. I basically ate the healthier snack portions. I started eating the regular meals that you're providing." And I was just so happy for that individual because they exactly got not just the educational portion, but then let me try it out experientially and then reap the results very, very rapidly.
Yeah, we talked about that before, this idea that you could put people on a path with a form of software that tracks what you are eating at the metabolic level. Not just the, are you eating an apple, are you eating a croissant or whatever, but going down to the metabolic level, since you have the ability to track what people are eating at the office, at least that's most of the day, you can actually help them with a particular goal. And that goal might be about losing weight, or it might be about, being less tired. It could be, a bit less tired in the afternoon. And there are ways that your nutrition path can get you there. And I think once people achieve this type of goals, they might be relatively easy to get goals. They pay attention. They say, wow, I was tired before in the afternoon and now I'm not. I was eating that much sugar and now I'm not. I can see that I can achieve that goal. What can I do next? It's like, preparing a marathon. If you never run before, you're not run a marathon of 42 kilometers right away. You would better not try. But if you start running for even 400 meters, and then the next month for kilometers, and then so on, it may actually take you only a year or maybe 2 years. I don't know if you start from scratch to get there. But it's the same with nutrition. Having relatively simple goals that you can achieve. And once you have achieved them and you feel better, so they are low-hanging fruits, you can actually do a lot through that. And what Garten has is the ability to quantify what people are eating, but not just are you eating, that type of food, but they're actually at the metabolic level, which has an effect on your microbiome and so on.
It's very important to measure that and to see results, because I think that's a positive feedback loop that you then see. It's like, oh, I ate this and oh, actually my microbiome feels better. And so if you have that positive feedback loop, it's easier to take the next steps. Very, very key concept. And in a way that really gets us to what we as Garten believe, that well-being really is a competitive advantage, because if you eat better, you feel better, you have less prone to presenteeism, the company's going to get benefits. In fact, I recently saw a study, I think it was released last year, where companies that invest in health, well-being, and safety of employees outperform the S&P 500 by 2%. And so there's actual financial impact from the actions that are being taken by individuals in the company, and then benefit the overall company as a result. And so that's it's really hard to ignore once you start looking at it from a company-based perspective. And actually, last week I was in New York at a conference called YPO Edge, and I met a McKinsey partner there and a food activist or a well-being activist actually. And they were proposing an even kind of more sweeping solution where they said ESG, the S in ESG, the social, should actually include well-being. We should track it. We should have compliance against it. It should be a key thing that companies are measuring because it has such a profound impact on performance. And so I'm kind of curious if you think that type of approach actually makes a lot of sense as well.
Well, it does. If you really believe, like I do, that there is a very strong link between your microbiome and your brain. Mm-hmm. One influences the other, but the other influences the one too. And so there is it's almost like a some kind of there is a symbiosis between everything in your body, but even more so directly from your microbiome, and which is totally influenced from the outside by what you are eating, and your brain and your ability to focus and your ability to, and also whether you're going to be feeling foggy or tired more easily, and so that in turn has a big effect on your productivity. Not that productivity should be the end game for any human being, but for a company, understanding that the well-being of their employees is a fairly complex thing. It's not just about providing a ping pong table somewhere, or it's not just about having a health insurance. It's about not having to use the health insurance. It's about the ability to want to play ping pong after you have had a lunch, because you are still in good shape to do it, and not trying to digest something which is not good for you. So I really believe that well-being is totally underrated today, and the lack of focus on well-being is one of the issues we have in the healthcare system. There's one number, since you mentioned McKinsey. I was in a McKinsey meeting not long ago, maybe not the same guy, maybe, but we were talking about the cost of healthcare linked to bad food or bad eating habit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So today, in the US, consumers spend 1.1 trillion on food, whether it's food they buy at the supermarket, whether it's food they consume in restaurants or takeout and deliveries, everything, 1.1 trillion. But the cost that has been estimated and published recently by the Rockefeller Foundation of the healthcare cost to society because of bad food, because of bad eating habits and so on, that leads to essentially the cost is essentially in diabetes type 2. It's also about cardiovascular issues that are linked to bad food and often obesity. Not just that, is 1.1 trillion. It's the same. So we are adding on top of what we are eating 1.1 trillion. Somewhere, as I mentioned before, that if you were doing impact accounting, the people who are selling this bad food to people that becoming over a long period of time, unfortunately, not short period of time from an accounting point of view, should reintegrate that into their own costs that they are pushing out to society. So 2.2 trillion is being spent between the bad food and not just bad food, but food and the cost to society of the bad food. That should be accounted for into a single basket. But the point is, if we were thinking much more well-being, we would be looking at things differently. This cost would probably not exist, or they would be very, very small. And we would be looking at, maybe we would be spending a little bit more on food, but much less on healthcare. And at the end, in the pocket of the consumer, there might be more money that would be still there at the end of the day, if you account for all the costs that eventually everyone is bearing, which is the cost of healthcare. And those consumers would be much better off, have a better life, be healthier, happier, and have more money and be eating better food. So I know it's a fairly simplistic way to look at it because these are macro numbers, but there is something about it, about the well-being being totally underrated today.
Yeah, I've seen similar statistics at the Milken Institute. It's just such a fascinating point of view. Include just overall chronic disease management. It's something like 10% of international GDP. I mean, that's the type of money that gets spent on just managing chronic disease. And the funny thing is, or not so funny, but the amazing thing is that 80% of that can easily be prevented through better diet, better nutrition, and not smoking. And so just these simple things, and then maybe you throw in additional things like meditation and better sleep, and then all of a sudden you have a basket of things that some people know they should do, but then don't end up doing because of either misinformation, miseducation, or just poor habits. And we're paying the wrong things, I would say, similar to what you're saying, Eric. It's much better to invest in preventative health or well-being, both to me are the same thing, than to bear the cost later. It's not I get there and then let's fix it and my life should be okay. It's much more, how do I live the best life today so that I don't get to that disease state in the first place?
Yeah, totally agree on that. But since we've talked about the fact that education is not enough, knowledge by itself it may not be enough to move the needle. What needs to happen is really this revolution in accounting, so that if everyone starts accounting for in the supply chain, including employers who are feeding cheap but not healthy food to their employees, they will start being accounted for that. If not directly on the bottom line, they will be penalized by the healthcare companies who will start saying, look, we cannot pay for that cost ultimately, which stems from your action. So if you insist on providing bad food to your employees, which is your right, then we'll charge you more or much more for your healthcare insurance, because we know that down the road, we're going to be paying a lot more for people. On average, it costs $400,000 for treating someone for dealing from a healthcare cost point of view, someone who has diabetes type 2. That's a lot of money per single patient. So the healthcare companies are saying we cannot do that anymore with 30% of the US population born after year 2000 expected to have developed diabetes type 2 by the year 2030. We cannot afford that. We're all going to go bankrupt. So the only way we can do that is to charge more for people who are not or being considerate or thinking through the implications. Cannot really charge the individual, because the individual is part of a society that offer them or give them very little choices and give them very little ability to move the needle at their level. Again, apart from a few people in a form of elite. So we need, people who would be targeted for change would be companies, and including employers who would be rewarded for doing something or penalized for doing something else, depending on how you look at it. But
on that reward standpoint, actually, Gary, our VP of marketing on our team, was part of a study where a company basically said, okay, well, we're charging the same amount for unhealthy and healthy food. What if we actually charged, half for the healthy food to our employees, and let's see what happens, and we subsidize. And so what ended up happening is that the employees ended up choosing, more healthy, salmon versus like a really greasy burger, for example. And that essentially decreased the rate of metabolic syndrome. And that was enough to just show to the insurance company, hey, our population is becoming less and less sick. They're becoming healthier. And the company essentially reaped a 4-to-1 return on investment just on subsidizing healthy food, because the insurance rate, instead of increasing every year, started flatlining, which is a very difficult feat for many companies to show. And so there's a direct link between input and then healthy outputs.
Fascinating. That's something that we need to. That's one thing that has been very difficult to so far to oppose to a number of people, either in the food industry or food skeptics whatever you want to call that, is the direct link, the causality link between bad food and bad health. People have been pushing back on that. The big food industry has been pushing back in the past on that, saying, yeah, how do you know that bad food is bad for you? Maybe it's the fact that people are not exercising enough, right. Or maybe they're eating a little bit too much of it, so that has been the challenge, because it's a complex issue. We eat a lot of different things. We and we do a lot of bad things also during the day. That very few people are so perfect that they end up leading a life where they exercise enough, they don't drink any alcohol, or they don't smoke anything, or they don't live in a city where you have a lot of stress and everything. Because at the end, if there is one variable that is not controlled, it's relatively easy for people who don't want to keep the statu quo in terms of nutrition to say, yeah, but maybe it's because people are living in a particular environment, and that creates the stress that make them end up having a problem, not the food. And that's one of the issues that, if we can get more scientific data, that more, data on from the equivalent of medical trials on that show that it's actually, healthy diet has a direct implication on your well-being. It's always difficult to push that.
Yeah, it's a challenge doubly because big food companies also often sponsor these studies and then often don't do long-term longitudinal studies. So maybe the effect after 3 months of eating the food is totally fine, there's no issue. But then what happens after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on? And so there's an inherent challenge in the way the studies are conducted as well.
The good news, though, let's stay positive again. The good news is things have changed dramatically just in the past 5 years. Mm-hmm. And we should not demonize totally these, the big food companies. First of all, they are full of people in those companies who are great people that actually think, they have families, they have kids, and they are pushing changes inside the companies. So even if, again, as long as you don't have a change in the accounting system, there is no reason for a food company to pay attention on the external cost and the externalities. They are not rewarded for that. Their stock price is not rewarded for that. It will change over time. But people are making, they're making changes. And also the good news is there are developments in the technologies, in the underlying technologies that are allowing, regenerative farming to be more and more efficient, so that you have less and less differential between when you look at the triple bottom line, the first bottom line for food being coming out of, I would not call that organic, but more like regenerative agriculture, which is a little bit easier to produce than organic, which has a lot of certification and so on. But good practices are being encouraged by the big companies, including people that you would not think of, like PepsiCo, or Nestle or Danone, but definitely, companies like PepsiCo are genuinely, going to be sourcing the majority of their ingredients in the chain from regenerative agriculture, which in turn will end up having, not necessarily obviously for soft drinks, but for all the other products they have, with something which will be much healthier. So there is movement, there is a momentum happening, which we should really acknowledge, which will make it much easier for people to get access to things. But again, without a company like Garten that during the day helps people get immediate access with some nudging because of some program you may have, into the right, direction. People, as you said before, they don't like to change, maybe a bit lazy, and they like the immediate reward of sugar and the immediate reward of a jolt of some, soft drink, and that is a little bit difficult to fight if you don't have this motivation that comes from a daily following that only a company like Garten can provide when it comes to food, and also provide you with the framework for meditation and other type of activities that you may have.
Yeah, it's essential to call that out because progress is definitely being made on different dimensions. And what I'm hearing is that it's really about more of a systematic change, because I like the kind of image that you had in your book around the human body was seen as a machine, and all that we need to do is feed the machine with calories. And so if that's the understanding of what the human body is, then the system worked perfectly well, and it was really great for its purposes. We just needed lots of calories, and we do it at the cheapest way possible. And so there's a really great social impact from that if that's your view of the world. But when the view of the world changes, then the system with it has to change. And I actually liked one of the quotes in your book where you said, only radical change will suffice now with these 4 headline priorities for the financial and business worlds: reform finance, fund innovation, align mission and outcome, and always measure for impact. And so I think that's a really great call, I think, for this really systematic change to happen.
Thank you. Glenn definitely read the book twice. That's great. No, I like what you said about the need to change, especially coming from a young German, because this idea that food was really was something which was calorie, was energy for the workers, was developed in the heydays of the industrial development of Germany in the late 19th century, and now today we need to review that. As I said before, we need to move from move away from just food is energy, food is basic energy and calorie, and that's it, to food is really our direct link to nature, to our direct environment, and including cultural, by the way, including the cultural environment, which goes back to well-being. You cannot really uproot people away from their culture without having them kind of wither like a flower that is being plucked out of the soil. So all these elements, all these pieces are very important to take into account when you think about what do we need to do to change the food system to something that much more local, seasonal, sustainable, but also keeps this idea of culture and deliciousness, which I think is one of the key ingredients that were missing totally from the first generation of healthy products. You had to choose between health and deliciousness. And I think that's, if there's something to be said about, the boring first generation vegan products based on tempeh and tofu, which, by the way, is not bad at all, but it's a bit boring. And if you think about it just from we don't want to move from food is energy to food is nutrition. And because we are missing something else, which is very important. And that will make the adoption of a new order much more difficult if we don't keep that idea of nutrition. Not just nutrition, but also deliciousness in the definition. So it's a feature, it's not a bug that it's actually delicious. It's something that people need to look for.
That was actually funny you mentioned that. That was actually our key insight with Garten initially. If something is healthier and better for you, but it tastes like cardboard, why should I adopt it as a consumer? And so how do we create something that's both delicious, nutritious, and meets and doesn't borrow from nature's balance sheet, but adds to nature's balance sheet? And so my key inspiration in that whole journey has been my grandma, because as a medical doctor of 50 years, she didn't get any chronic diseases. And her message to us as grandchildren or children was eat from my organic garden, go to bed on time, have healthy exercise habits, have your friends and family around, like really simple things. And she did a lot of things just through her actions without even saying it. For example, I visit her and she says, "Oh, would you like a mint tea?" And I say, "Oh yeah, absolutely." She goes to her garden, cuts a few mint leaves and makes the tea. And it's the most delicious mint tea that I've ever had. And so those factors all blend together really, really nicely. And so I feel really grateful that she's been such a great inspiration in my life.
Yes, I think your grandma has been an inspiration to many of you, many of us through garden, because it's clear that without her there would be no garden. But there is something about the wisdom of past generations that did not grow up on a food system that basically outsourced the production of food to a third-party industry. That industry essentially did not exist until the 1950s, when post-war, for good reason, we had to invent a new system where women were in the workforce, and we had to make up with a really strong separation between cities and countryside, and it was much more difficult to get directly food from the farm for people. Even if there did exist before, obviously, big cities, they were a much more integrated system of supply of small farms into the big cities. There are some really interesting documentaries, but not movies, but written documents that were research that was done on that web of supplies of basically what we call today farmers markets in New York City, in Paris, in Berlin, in early in the 20th century. That basically kind of disappeared progressively, and as this industry was started. But people who were already cooking in the 40s and 50s and probably 60s still had this notion, and much more not intuitive, but based on knowledge passed from generation to generation through culinary culinary habits and culinary wisdom, I would call that, and that kind of got lost in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and even more so in the past 10 years. Why would you bother do that when you can just tap an app and say, I want that now, and whatever it is in terms of recipe, whatever it is in terms of content, it doesn't matter. You can get it in a snap. So I think until now, I think it's changing slightly now. People have been seeing that as the ultimate, the ultimate fantasy for food, but it actually cuts you off from so many dimensions of food that I think eventually it actually creates some problems. The question is not going back to the 18th century where people were regularly dying of hunger and not enough food, but there should be something that reconnects, because we, as we said earlier, I like this analogy of we are what our food ate, and understanding what your body needs are, which means that you need to be connected with your body, which goes back to what we were talking about before, about the mind being developed enough so that you are connected to your body and you can hear from inside what is good for you. When do you need to eat? Do you really need to eat, or is that something else that your body is telling you? Are you tired? Are you stressed? And if it's stress, it may not be hunger. So this type of thing, which you get through working on your mind, working on meditation, working on really being reconnected with yourself, is the definition of well-being.
It's such an important point because a lot of also food products are designed for addiction. So refined sugar is very addicting. You get a high without the fiber, and so it releases very, very quickly in your mind. And then you get to a sugar crash and you're like, oh no, what happened? I feel not good about it anymore. Then you have another one, and it just creates this downward spiral for sure. It's just such an important point how everything that we ingest, whether it's food, whether it's emotions, whether it's environments, whether it's meditation, to really strengthen our mind, to build our gut. I think I read a study somewhere that most of the serotonin is actually residing in our gut, which is fascinating because you would think most of it would be in the brain, but really it's in the gut. And so as food gets digested, it can also have impact on your mental health. So you can eat specific foods that are a good counter against depression or anxiety. And so it's just this amazing human system is not just a machine, it's really interconnected. And I really like sort of that point from you. In closing, would you like to leave any other message with our viewer?
Well, I think something which I didn't write in my book is that I believe that we have a collective responsibility to leave this planet in a much better shape than we have put it in today. I'm speaking, even more so to my generation than your generation, Michael. But I think this is something which is really driving me through this motion right now. Not just about writing the book, but what we are doing at Astanor Ventures, taking a lot of risk in backing companies that may be a little bit ahead of the curve, but that they all have collectively the ability to make as you said, Michael, a systemic change to what we are doing right now with the agri-food system.
That's a prolific point to end on. Again, Eric, thank you so much for spending the time with us and with all of the Garten viewers on the Garten Infinity Speaker Series. Eric is a prolific impact investor and has spearheaded a lot of really key initiatives in the space. So definitely follow him, whether it's reading the book, Costing the Earth, or following him on other podcasts, or just following Astanor Ventures. It's a treat. So thank you so much, Eric, for being here.
Thank you so much, Michael, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.